Some people have asked me to have a look at the EU Parliament COVID conference with David Mattern. He seems to attract conspiracy theorists who are all too keen to listen to whatever he says, even though what he says is complete rubbish, because the guy is a total sellout control op, playing his part in the circus with what this was really all about. So let's have a listen to some of the things that were being said.
Most of you don't know that coronavirus as a model of a pathogen was isolated in 1965. Coronavirus was identified in 1965 as one of the first infectious replicatable viral models that could be used to modify a series of other experiences of the human condition. It was isolated once upon a time associated with the common cold. But what's particularly interesting about its isolation in 1965 was that it was immediately identified as a pathogen that could be used and modified for a whole host of reasons. And you heard me correctly, that was 1965. And by the way, these slides are public domain. You're welcome to look at every single reference. Every comment that I made is based on published material, so do make sure that you look at those references. But in 1966, the very first COV coronavirus model was used as a transatlantic biological experiment in human manipulation. And you heard the date, 1966.
And from that, and we can unpack a few little pieces of it, and we can see that he said that coronavirus as a model. Well, it absolutely is a model. It's a computer model, and it doesn't actually exist because there's not an actual virus. And he's at least telling us that, if nothing else. But he then goes on to say that it was isolated in 1965. And of course that means the post-1954 meaning of the word isolated, which means the new isolation, which means not isolated anything, because by then they knew there was no such thing as a virus and they just faked it up. So we've got to be careful about what version of the word isolation that we're really talking about, because it's one of those interchangeable words which basically means fraud. And he goes on to say that there's a replicatable viral model, back to the model again, used to modify the human condition. So back to this human condition. Well, human condition is the behavioural change, which is what the agenda is also doing. So we're not infecting anybody with a virus, we're just changing the way people behaved. And then it goes on to say in 1966 the first COV experiment on human manipulation. And of course he picks his words quite carefully, and sometimes you wonder why he chose that word rather than another word when he's talking about a virus. But of course it's an agenda that's going on, and it is a manipulation that's going on, so he's actually being correct. Just he hopes you don't pick up what he was actually saying. Well, let's have a look at the next part, and we'll come back in a wee minute.
Because in 2002, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill patented, and I quote, an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. Listen to those words, infectious replication defective. What does that phrase actually mean? For those of you not familiar with language, let me unpack it for you. Infectious replication defective means a weapon. It means something meant to target an individual, but not have collateral damage to other individuals. That's what infectious replication defective means.
Right, so this is another part which I'll cut out just for interest to see what he says. I cut out some of his other stuff, but I'll just stick to this just now. But anyway, so 2002, he talks about patent for an infectious replication defective clone coronavirus. And of course that does not mean that the virus is a weapon, but the whole thing or belief of a virus is the actual weapon, because there is no actual virus, and that's the key point here. It's the weapon isn't the virus, it's the belief in the virus. So he goes on to say that viruses do not exist in nature, but he tries to mix in gain of function, lab work, and stuff like that. And what he's doing there is admitting on the start when he talks about models, because viruses don't exist in nature, and he's sort of saying that without saying it, but tries to blend it into the gain of function and lab work to get the conspiracy theorists going that, oh well, right, see, Fauci did this or did that, and Chinese did this, or there was a bat, or whatever it was. They were trying to get this lab idea back in the head of people, because this justifies vaccines moving forward, of course, and tries to make it sound like that the vaccine was just a mistake. But that's, of course, is all the rubbish, because viruses don't exist. So what he's really doing here is that the term means that the myth of the virus is infectious, and that's all that's infectious, not the actual virus. And that's why he says that will harm nobody. That's exactly what he said. So how could you have a virus that affects nobody? Because, as he said, replication defective. And how can a virus, if it's what you think it's meant to be in any way be replication defective, which means it can't reproduce. So that means it's certainly not a virus. And that's the point here. He's actually telling us that, we just got to listen carefully to what he's saying. Now, when he's given us all this nonsense about dates and the first isolation and all the rest of it, the problem is, we've known, if you try to say that we're making the claim, or these viruses, little arrows pointing to what they're talking about, and all these bits here, which these pictures have been used to depict SARS-CoV-2, but he's talking about SARS-CoV, which are pretty much the same thing. But this quote here, which says that most of the published images depicting the suspected virus are very similar to, if not identical to multivesicular bodies, MVBs, and it goes on to say that MVBs have been well known since the 60s, which is when David Martin's talking about here. So all that is pretty much current rubbish. So we suspect that the EM images of SARS-CoV-2 published today are in fact MVBs, and that's it exactly. And that's what David Martin's talking about, really, that there is no isolated virus, it's all a scam, and you can go to that URL there. So hopefully that unpacks it all and brings that one to an end.